lecture series is a partnership project led by the Prince William Sound Science Center. Our partners include the UAF Alaska Sea Grant Extension Office, the Cordova chapter of the Prince William Sound Audubon Society, who hosts 1 lecture a month, and the U.S. Forest Service, who generously donates the space and equipment. My name is Meadow. I run the lecture series. Coming up next Monday, we have Mandy Lindeberg, who wrote the field guide to seaweeds of Alaska. She's going to be talking about seaweeds, nearshore fish, and the Gulf Shore Monitoring Program. And that's going to be Monday. So Monday, not Tuesday. I'll pass the sign-in sheet around in case anybody missed it. And now our speaker tonight, Paula Cullenberg, is the director of Alaska Sea Grant, a university NOAA partnership program based at UAF. She's worked in fisheries and community development in Alaska for over 30 years, as a marine advisory agent in Bristol Bay, as the director of the university's observer training program, as the leader of the statewide marine advisory program, and as director of Alaska Sea Grant for the last 2 years. She has an MS degree in fisheries from the University of Washington, and many years of experience fishing for salmon in Washington, the lower Yukon, and currently as a settler in Bristol Bay. Both of her sons paid their college tuition from summer work on the Bristol Bay mudflats. Her family currently sells a small amount of their fish directly to Anchorage residents each year. Thanks for coming, Paula.
So you're going to record this, and does it matter whether people talk during my
Oh no,
talk?
participation is encouraged.
Okay. Participation is encouraged. This is a small group, so you can chat along the way. I have maybe 20 slides here, so feel free to dive in. And this is probably a subject that you guys would have opinions about, so feel free to share those with me as we go along. Because this is I'm going to talk about a research project that Sea Grant is funding along with the North Pacific Research Board, and we're not finished with this project. We're about done most of the field work, and the analysis is starting. So I'm just going to talk about some of the things we found out so far, but it's not an end product by any means. But I think it's still interesting, and I think you'll find it interesting. So as I mentioned, we're funded by Sea Grant and by the North Pacific Research Board, and having 2 funders for this project allowed us to hire 2 graduate students to work with us. So you can see the principal investigators are Courtney Carruthers. She's an anthropologist, a professor at UAF. Rachel Dunkersloot is also an anthropologist, and she works for the Alaska Marine Conservation Council. And then myself, and I am not an anthropologist, I'm a fisheries biologist by training, and I got into this project because I have a fair amount of experience in policy in the state. And so policy is one part of this study. And then, as I mentioned, we have 2 graduate students. Jessie Coleman is up at UAF, and she is a PhD student, so she's looking at the Bristol Bay region, which is one of the regions for the study. And then Danielle Ringer lives in Kodiak, and she's working on a master's degree, and she's focusing on the Kodiak area. So those are kind of our 2 study sites for this project. And you know, why is this graying of the fleet, thinking about the next generation of Alaska's fishermen, important? From a Sea Grant perspective, we have, our program has a number of goals that we work on. One of them is healthy, sustainable fisheries that provide a long-term economic source for Alaskans. Another one of our goals is vibrant coastal communities that have strong and diverse economies. So you can see why we're interested in this project. And then more specifically, what's been happening in our state is that the average age of state limited entry permit holders has increased from about age 40 to age 50 since 1980.
You ready for me to hit the lights?
And that's pretty similar to the demographic of a lot of our country in general. We have this big bubble of 50 and 60-year-olds who are kind of baby boomers, and the younger generation, Julia's age, etc., in that 20-30 group is smaller. There are just fewer Americans in that age group. So in some ways, every occupation is sort of feeling this sort of grain. So if you talk to seafood processors in the state, they'll talk about that. If you talk to fishing game folks, they'll talk about that as well. So everyone's sort of trying to think about how to sustain their occupation given that the demographics are the way they are in our country. So of course, in a place like Alaska where we're so dependent on fisheries as part of our economics, it's important that we kind of think about what this might mean for our state if there were fewer Alaskans going into the fisheries.
So, could you kind of speak up just a little bit? I think it's
okay. And so we're calling that succession of access rights. Basically, when you're retiring out, you have a succession plan. Who's going to be the next person moving into your job? So, and then access rights are limited entry permits or quota, that kind of thing. So, so that has implications for fishing communities, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So in 2012, the legislature passed a resolution that basically identified that caring about the next generation of Alaska's fishermen is a pressing concern for the state. And then when Governor Walker first started, he had a series of transition teams, and one of them was focusing on fisheries. And that transition team also identified ensuring continued access to Alaska's fisheries by Alaskans as a high priority. So those are some of the priorities here. So this project is really kind of thinking about, okay, what are the economic and non-economic ways that we can encourage that next generation? What are the barriers? What kind of resources do we have? What should we think about ahead of time? And that's sort of the purpose of the project. And remember, feel free to jump in if you want. So just I've got 3 graphs here that kind of illustrate what's going on. This is an example of salmon seine permits, and as I said, we worked in Kodiak and Bristol Bay primarily. So you can see these are some of the smaller communities in Bristol Bay. And for example, if you look at Old Harbor, it looks like in 1975 they had about 28 seine permits, and then by 2014 we were down to about 14, so about a 50% decline. And you can see that that's kind of consistent, maybe not quite as big of a decline, but a place like, I don't know, Kodiak has gone from 13 to 3 permits. I'm sorry, that's Uzinki. So you can kind of get a sense of what the implications that might be to that community. And then if you look specifically at permit holders that are under 40, so younger permit holders, you can see even a little bit of a steeper decline. And again, this is some of the Kodiak communities, and then also king salmon, South Naknek, Kokonak, which is up by Lake Iliamna. Pretty consistent decline over time in the number of permits held by people that are under 40. And again, these are some of the larger communities in Bristol Bay and Kodiak. Kodiak, Dillingham, Togiak, Naknek. It's interesting, and again, we haven't really analyzed all the data, but it's interesting to look at Togiak, which is the one community you've seen so far that actually is kind of holding its own in terms of numbers of permits, and I'm not exactly sure why that is at this point. And this is pretty consistent all over the state. So I looked at Cordova before I came down here tonight, and Cordova had about 1,000 salmon limited entry permits, resident permits, in 1980, and now there's about 533. And there's been a little bit of up and down over those 35 years, but that's pretty consistent with the rest of the state, communities around the state. So there's been this ongoing decline. So for this particular project, research objectives, there's a lot of words here, so I'll read through them. So what we're doing is documenting and comparing perceived and experienced barriers to entry into the fisheries and also upward mobility in the fisheries in both Bristol Bay and Kodiak. And we're kind of looking at geographic, economic, social, and cultural factors that influence young people's attitudes toward fisheries. We'll talk about how we did that here in a minute. We're going to try and identify some successful pathways that can be models for young people entering the fisheries in those regions. And then talk about and look at maybe some policy responses that might be useful. So that's kind of why we're doing what we're doing and what our objectives are. Any questions or comments? And these are the study communities. So we're trying to do a mixture of population size, demographics. So we're going to a couple of villages. Kodiak is primarily a Yupik community. The communities around Bristol Bay, except for Kodiak, are CDQ. They have a CDQ in their region. So we're trying to get a little bit of a variety in these communities. And so this is what's called, as I said, I'm not an anthropologist, this is called an ethnographic mixed method research study. And I looked up what ethnographic meant before I put this talk together. And that basically means, anybody here an anthropologist? Basically means a study of the social and cultural interactions. And then mixed method, you'll see what the variety of things that we did here. So first thing we did was look at fisheries data from the Commercial Fisheries Entry Commission and from the census. We did semi-structured interviews. So if we had been working in Cordova, we would have interviewed young people, and we would have interviewed young people that were just entering the fishery and also older people that had been in for a long time. So it was sort of trying to get a whole wide swath of input from people on what they had experienced. Then we interviewed all of the middle and high school students in all of those communities, which is about 800 kids. And that's been completed as well. And then we did sort of a literature review of what kind of research has been out there, and then what's happening in other parts of the world related to this. And I just thought I would stick up here. This is just part of the survey that we did with middle school and high school kids. And when you interview kids, you have to go through a lot of permitting and get a lot of approvals to engage with kids, and we were able to do that. And this is just sort of, it was really the survey, and I have a copy of it if anybody wants to look at it. It was really about 3 pages long as well, but these are just some of the kinds of questions that we asked kids. You know, what's your perception? Is it difficult for a young person to get involved in to be a fisherman? Fishing doesn't really suit me. Attitudes. So where we are now is we're transcribing the interviews, which is a really laborious job that graduate students do that kind of thing. So the graduate students are doing that. They're transcribing the interviews, and when you transcribe an interview like that, you basically pull out common themes and you try and score them by common themes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the themes that have come out. We're reviewing the surveys of the middle and high school students, finishing up the literature review, and then we're starting to do a little bit of policy analysis. And I wanted to mention, if anyone's interested, the middle of January, we're going to do a workshop in Anchorage, specifically looking at legal and regulatory options related to access. So what are there any new ideas, things like community permit banks or the community quota program? Are there ways that we can look at the regulatory system that we have in our state and adjust it in a way that helps this situation that we have in our state? It's a really difficult thing to do in Alaska because if you're familiar with the state constitution, we are very careful in our state constitution not to do any kind of preference for anyone based on residence in our state. We're a very equal access focused state, so it's a little bit tough to do it, but we are looking at that. So just a few results here. And kind of interesting, these are just some of the really early results from the student survey. But you can see a big difference between Kodiak and Bristol Bay. And, you know, I'm not going to hypothesize why that is, but people can think. I mean, you can probably come up with some ideas yourself. But you know, what percentage currently working in commercial fishing for middle and high school students? And it strikes me as that's a pretty low number for Kodiak. When you think about Kodiak as a community that actually has active commercial fishing 11 out of 12 months out of the year. It's a really unique community in our state in that sense, but really very small percentage there. Interested in getting more involved in commercial fishing. Again, Kodiak middle and high school students, pretty low response versus Bristol Bay. And family ties to commercial fishing. Again, lower in Kodiak than in Bristol Bay. And maybe that makes sense in some ways, but I guess our team so far was a little surprised by those responses for Kodiak. And interesting, I don't know what you guys imagine Cordova would say to that kind of a high school and middle school kids would say to that kind of questionnaire, but I think that was interesting. So that's all I'm going to show you about the student surveys at this point. That's as far as we've gotten. But I did want to give you a few basic themes that have come out of the interviews. And this is a picture of Danielle Ringer, who is our graduate student working in Kodiak, interviewing fishermen in Kodiak. And I think a lot of these are going to be things that you would probably, kind of are common sense themes that you have seen and you would have heard of, but these are things that have come up on a regular basis, some in Kodiak, some in Bristol Bay. So the first one, of course, is family, the feeling that Kodiak people talked a lot about how often there would be family members working on the back deck of a seiner together. Or they mentioned that set net fisheries were very family-oriented in Kodiak. And then in Bristol Bay, again, I think people felt that fishing was something that you did as a family member. It was your pathway to commercial fishing. And then on the other side, that fishing was very integral in a way to support your family in Bristol Bay. So that's kind of the family comments. But this is a quote from a female drift captain in Dillingham who says, "The whole family was on the back deck of the boat." She said there's very few families that are doing that anymore. It happens in Kodiak. I presume they're still doing it that way over there, but that's how the kids learn, and that's how they decide whether they like it or not, or if they want to do it or not. So, I think that's probably the family connection, of course, is very strong. And then another one that's, I think most of us agree on, fishing is a lifestyle, not just a job. There's a quote from a young Kodiak singer: "Fishing is freedom, camaraderie. These guys are like brothers, and even if someone you don't like has a boat on fire, you just stop and help. You don't even think about it. It's something you know down to the bone, and you don't have to be told to do that." And then a couple other great quotes from the lifestyle perspective. In Kodiak, you either love it or you hate it, and when you love it, it will be in your blood forever. There's probably a lot of fishermen that would feel like they could say that. And then in Bristol Bay, well, fishing's definitely our lifestyle. S puts away fish for us during the summer. I spent 2 months on the water this summer, pretty much straight. The excitement, the stress, the no sleep. You're working pretty hard. Sit there figuring it out. Like I said, it's all a puzzle. It's definitely a lifestyle. So I think that one's a big theme. Another thing that came up was outside employment, and particularly in Bristol Bay. So, Bristol Bay used to be the place where you could go make your entire year's income in one season, and that's not really the case anymore. But some of the things that came up was that definitely this need for additional income, but are the jobs available in the Bristol Bay region for people? And will your jobs allow you to go fishing? And there were some comments that 20, 30 years ago, it was common for jobs in Bristol Bay to allow people to go fishing and take a few weeks off in the summer, that was less common nowadays. So I think this whole outside employment question about, especially with younger people, what kind of a future are schools and our parents creating for them, in terms of college or jobs, or I think that probably will be something that we're going to see more of when we analyze this information. And then on the other hand, there's the whole piece about getting out of the fishery, and how effectively do we enable that in our state for people to be able to exit and then keep the fishing access rights and the fishing in the community and with the local residents. And so here's a quote: "I think about getting out of fishing. My son's getting interested in fishing. He helps run one of our boats. I don't know if it's best to get out in little pieces or keep it intact. I want to protect the crewmen because we've got 6 to 7 years of their loyalty, and it's something we've worked to build up, and it'll just blow away if I sell out." So I think this is something that we've heard about in our state, especially with, this person is from Kodiak. When you have a lot of your retirement income wrapped up in your fishing access, your fishing license and boat, it's a bit of a struggle. So that has come up in interviews. In Kodiak, there's a lot of talk about diversification, and again, Kodiak's unique because it does have this very diverse fishery, but given all of the privatization that's happened in all of the different species, it's a lot more difficult certainly perceived that it's a lot more difficult to get involved in all of the different fisheries. You have to give a lot of income to do that. So, and this older seiner said, now it's hard to fish year-round and keep doing it. Can't work for yourself year-round as a young fisherman anymore. So that's, I think, seen as a bit of a barrier. And then, of course, access to capital. And I think that in general, people kind of go to this access to capital. It's really, really expensive to get into fishing, and that's the big barrier for young people nowadays. And it certainly is one barrier. I'm not sure it's the only one, but it came up consistently. Who's going to loan a 21-year-old without any assets $500,000 to go fishing? No one. So. I wanted to get into halibut after crewing for several years, but with the astronomical price to buy cues, it was just not worth it. I could never catch enough to make the payments and actually come out ahead. So certainly the money involved is a big deal. And then finally, I think what's come up a number of times is this concept of transitioning from being a crew member to being a skipper. And that came up consistently, and I think it's something that we probably don't identify as a barrier, but certainly is one for young people. And it has to do with risk, I think, perceived risk, and all of the scary things that might happen. So he says, crews sometimes think they can do better if only they could be running the boat. And then some of them try and do it, and they just can't hack it. Big wake-up call for a lot of them when you're calling the shots. Certainly that's the case. And then I think money has got to be a huge barrier. I think for people growing up in fishing communities, and here, it's probably not that hard to get a crew job or get started fishing, but making the jump to buying a permit is just money and confidence and support, probably. So this is one of the themes that came out from both Kodiak and Bristol Bay. So this is a Kodiak quote on the top and a Bristol Bay quote on the bottom. So I think probably can't underestimate that big mental leap to the level of responsibility that's involved in ownership of a fishing operation. So in terms of public policy considerations, you can kind of look at those themes and think about what could we do as a state. If we're concerned about the next generation of Alaska fishermen, what can we do as a state? What kinds of policy things would be appropriate for us to do that might encourage entry of the next generation into the fishing industry? And certainly one of them is capital. Are the loan programs that the state has available appropriate? Are the funding amounts enough? Is the collateral system working for young people? So that's one that's been looked at. Retirement options is an interesting one too. I mean, what can we do to enable a commercial fisherman who wants to retire, who has a lot of money wrapped up in their fishing operation? How can we encourage them to sell that operation to a young person, preferably someone who's in the same town in their community, if it means that they could potentially lose money, they could maybe not earn as much as they could selling it somewhere outside. So what kind of public policy things could be put together that could help that? You know, are there any kinds of things? I think that's something that we're going to look at. Entry without family connections. So if it's harder to get into the fishing industry, if you don't have any family connections, and you know, a place like Cordova, I think there are probably a lot of young people that come here and they get involved in fishing, even though they don't have those family connections. But if you think about some of the smaller communities in our state, say Uzinki or Old Harbor, that you know used to have 25 fishing permits and now they have 3. I think that makes it a little bit more clear how difficult it could be maybe for young people in Uzinki to start fishing if they don't have those kinds of role models or those kinds of family connections. So is there, you know, when you're thinking about what kind of state we want for our state in the future, you know, are there things that we can do or we should think about that might help that? Same with diversification. When we put limited access on halibut and shrimp and salmon and herring, are we, by doing that, we may be making the fishery efficient, we may be protecting the resource. Are there ways to build in entry access for younger people? Or are there ways to address that without causing all of these huge high costs to get into each one of those? Something to think about. And then again, relationship to other occupations. How can we make the fishing lifestyle compatible with other jobs? And is that something that we could talk about as a state, so we could potentially enable people to be able to go fishing and work in other positions? So finally, I mean, I think in conclusion, basically what we find out is that Alaskans are involved in fisheries for lots of different reasons and in lots of different ways. Commercial subsistence, it's part of our pride, it's for our income, it's well-being for our families. It's not a single focus by any means. But ensuring that strong generation of fishermen in our coastal places is really part of the sustainability of our coastal communities. So I think it's important to think about that from that perspective because of the strong economic input and the lifestyle input. So ultimately, I think at the end of our project, we're going to try and make some recommendations on how can public policy support the well-being of both fishing people and fishing communities. And in some cases, they're a little bit different, actually. So I just thought I'd put a plug in for the Young Fisherman Summit, which is one thing that Alaska Sea Grant has done for now, 12 years, right? As a tool in our state to encourage young fishermen. And we'll be doing the next one the end of January in Juneau. And that's all I have. I did want to mention that we have a Facebook page for this study, and we have a website as well. So as I mentioned, here we are just at the beginning of 2016, and probably this project is going to wrap up toward the end of 2016. And there'll be little bits coming out over the next year as the PIs make presentations at the Marine Science Symposium and at other venues and things happen, but that's where we are right now. So, thank you. Thank you. Any comments? Anything sound really bogus here?
I have a question. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned community permit banks. Is there anywhere that that is being applied in Alaska, or is there that model coming from elsewhere?
Yeah, that model is coming from elsewhere. You know, currently in our state, the only person that can own the only way a limited entry permit can be owned is by an individual. So a community permit bank would require some kind of a change in the limited entry law to allow a group to hold a number of limited entry permits that could potentially be leased. And we do that in the federal system. We do that with the community quota entity program. We have a system for that, but and I'm not at all sure that it's necessarily going to get through the state system. It's a kind of an idea that's been kicked around. So, yeah.
Along that same line, I've always thought of that, but I would think the existing limited entry system and the state could back the loan or, control the permits still, but the community would have to buy in to putting up the money and possibly taking some losses.
Yeah.
But if the community feels it's strongly enough that they need the support.
Right, and that's the theory
so
behind
you
this.
wouldn't have to change any rules.
Well, the theory behind the community quota entity program is that communities can purchase halibut quota and then they can lease it to local residents.
Yeah, I understand.
And so that's in the federal system and that's legal and allowed. But the problem that it's been really a tough road because communities have had a hard time coming up with the capital to buy halibut quota. Halibut quota is expensive and where do you get the money to do that? So I would say it's been kind of a mixed bag in terms of success, but in our state system, we have an owner a permit holder on board. If you own the permit, you have to be an individual and you have to be on the boat. So it's it could happen if we could change the limited entry law, but that's what that would take, I think. So.
I'm sorry. I was just focusing on loaning money to young people to buy the permits.
Right, and there is a program in Bristol Bay. They have a CDQ group there, and they do loans to young people. They don't own the permit, but yeah.
Is that BBEDC or?
Yeah.
How effective is that in helping keep salmon permits there?
But it hasn't been very effective. They haven't had great success, which kind of leads them to thinking that maybe it's more than just money. Maybe it's more risk. Maybe it's, I can buy the permit, but I don't know how to run a boat, and I don't have anybody to teach me how to do it, and maybe that's it. I think that's one of the reasons we're focusing on Bristol Bay for some of these questions on perceptions and.
Well, and there are so many other erratic factors.
Yeah,
So is your study looking at where permits are going? Yeah.
There have been studies that have looked at that to some degree. So, for example, in Bristol Bay used to have. Bristol Bay right now has the lowest percentage of locally held permits since limited entry went into effect. It's like 23% of the Bristol Bay permits are held by people that live in the region, and you think, well, there's not really any other way to make a living out there, so it'd be kind of nice if some of those permits stayed in the region. And so there have been a few studies out there, and it's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, some of it is people move out of Bristol Bay, so it's migration. A really good chunk of it is transfers. And so Bristol Bay is a good fishery to, if you have a lot of money, you can go into Bristol Bay with a good chunk of cash and probably buy a permit from somebody, and then you might have another job outside of the state or outside of the region, and it's such a pulse fishery. It's kind of, I think it exacerbates this permit drain in that fishery in particular because your commitment is so much less. You can go in there and fish for a month and make a bunch of money, and so that one I think people feel it more, see it more in that region than others. But I was surprised by this Kodiak thing, the high school kids in Kodiak having such a small connection to the fishing industry. That surprised me. Yeah, Alexis.
So
Is there a focus or addressing like the crew matriculation in the absence of family introduction or that family passage of the fishery? Like the question of how much crew is matriculating into ownership, or did I?
Well, that's a logical question, I think, and that might be a logical solution to some of this. I'm not sure that we're specifically digging into that question in a way that it's going to come out as clearly as it should. But, you know, if that's the case, if that's a logical stepping stone from a crew member into an ownership position, and that would help solve the problem, then that would be a really good place to look.
I mean,
And maybe there's a program to do that. You know, one of my pet peeves is, I mean, there's pros and cons, but right now you can't lease a state salmon permit from someone else, even though it's done kind of illegally. I don't know about where you guys fish, but where we fish in Bristol Bay, it's done all the time. And it's in some ways it's too bad you can't lease a permit, because I think if you're a young person, leasing a permit from a permit holder that, you know, over time might be something that would be a little bit more doable than trying to fork over $370,000, you know, for a boat and a permit when you're 20 years old or 25. I don't know.
Yeah, but it also might increase the permit value, because then someone with a bunch of money could have a
Right.
permit and lease it.
Right, yeah, yeah. And a lot of, there are, you know, people that argue against community preference for permits will say that if you have community permits versus open permits, then the open permits, maybe the value will be reduced, and so they don't want to do that. So you can get into this, what's good for an individual fisherman is not necessarily what's good for a fishing community. They're not always compatible. And that's, you know, that's a question, that's a public policy question for the state. You know, are we trying to support the economic gain of individual fishermen, or are we trying to support the livelihood and the vibrancy of a fishing community like Cordova? You know, I think probably the answer is yes to both of those. So how can you develop a policy that would support both of those kinds of things? So.
How much of the grading of the fleet might end up having a self-correction? Because, you know, at some point, there's going to be a lot of permits coming available because that fleet just isn't going to be able to go out again. You know, and if there's not fishermen coming up behind them, at some point the market gets flooded.
Well, that's true, although I'm kind of interested in the people that are coming up behind them. I'm interested in them being Alaskans.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in them living in the town where the permit lives right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, probably somebody will buy them. That's true, but maybe they won't live in Alaska. So is that something we need to worry about? I don't know.
But do you think that the price, you know, once you bring in enough permits, the price of a permit's going to start coming down?
I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Maybe the older fishermen are just not going to quit.
Well, you know, Sunday they're talking about how to beat aging, so, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't think, you know, I'm not trying to imply that somebody who's 50 years old who's fishing, I mean, that's much younger than I am, stop fishing. I think, you know, we are an aging, like I said in the beginning, we're kind of an aging population in general, so, yeah.
Has your study looked at, part of the problem is there's a lack of other opportunities, that, you know, resource development, so people are able to work as an engineer or whatever. Some of the Bristol Bay permits have migrated to Nome, or, you know, they moved to where the jobs are.
Yeah.
So if you're not going to allow, that would be another way to tackle the problem.
Yeah.
Open up some more opportunities other than fishing would make a healthier fishery.
Yeah, and the flip side of that, I wonder, you know, a place like Kodiak, in high school and in middle school, do their guidance counselors and teachers understand the fishing industry? Do they promote that as a valuable occupation, or do they lean toward the college thing, track? You know, I mean, it's not like fishing is this incredibly amazing occupation necessarily, it's not for everybody, but if the people that are guiding young people don't have any concept of that as an occupation, as a viable profession, maybe that has something to do with why Kodiak, which is a pretty large community, maybe the young people there feel driven toward college, not
Or the
necessarily-
military, because Kodiak has a
Or
lot
military.
of Coast Guard, huge for Coast Guard.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point.
So maybe I'm jumping off topic, but it seems like a great segue into the workforce development program and advancements in terms of getting, into schools the access to information of a different track. That's a
Right.
skilled labor program that's very much maritime industry
Right.
focused and not necessarily.
Right. And we don't do much of that in the state yet. And we barely have started to describe the maritime economy as a big sector of our economy. I mean, fishermen are often, it's a very small group, and it's not really expressed as the huge amount of people that it actually is. I mean, we've estimated the 60,000, 70,000 jobs in the state related to the ocean. The state has been doing that, and they've estimated that. Well, that's, there's only 650,000 people that live in the state, so that's a lot of jobs related to the ocean. But we don't really, we don't have really good training programs, we don't have good career paths, I don't know about Cordova, but in Anchorage, where I live, Anchorage kids don't hear about jobs in the ocean or near the ocean, any of them really, other than maybe being a biologist. So we've got a long way to go, I think, in that area. If you look at a place like Newfoundland, really good sense of that, and they do a really good job training, and they invest in it, and we just haven't done that as well as we could in the state. So that might be another area, I think.
But it's coming along. There's
Yeah,
some
it's
focus
coming
and
along.
attention and some work.
Okay. So far as an exit strategy are involved, I mean, you set up a program with CPAD where you can kind of owner finance, partially owner finance it. Is that working? Are many people using that? And
I think that's a really good model, actually. I've heard mixed reviews, particularly with CFAB, and I don't know about the state does it too, I think. It's called a loan guarantee program, basically, so you have a relationship with your lender and then the person you're selling to, and if they fall through, then the lender bails you out, or it's some kind of a loan guarantee program that enables you to sell over time to someone without the same amount of risk, and I think that is a good model.
Yeah, from my understanding, maybe clarify it. So if I want to sell my permit, I say, okay, 25% of it I want to owner finance. So if it's $100,000, 25%, and then now I can get that interest at 5% from my money. But it's basically it's guaranteed by the bank, so they've got all the paperwork, and if somebody defaults, then the bank goes after them, and I should be covered. So I mean, it seems like a really good option. I mean, you're going to sell out, and what are you going to do with your money? Well, if you can get guaranteed, 5%, actually that's pretty good these days.
Yeah, so that would be a good model if you're for the exit strategy and for the capital access for young people.
And then you can choose
Yeah.
maybe a little more locally because you know the person so you can owner finance a little more.
So how is it working here? Or is the next generation happening here in this town?
Well, this is something we've talked about a lot, whether or not to buy in, and I think that there's a lot of inhibiting factors. It's one, the risk involved is that there's so much risk. Two, it's like, the amount of money that you would have to put forward with not having a lot of assets or experience, a few years, and I think the other, just in our case, it's like we have to consider what would you do the other part of the year? There really are very, very few jobs in this community. And then the other thing is do you want to buy a house in this community? Do you want to have children in this community? It's going to be, as someone that's looking at all of those things, becoming a homeowner, becoming a parent, becoming fish wife, how could we possibly do all of those things? You can't. It's going, how could you buy a permit in a boat and buy a house and become a parent? All at once, all of these people that are between the ages of 20 and 30, I don't know. we can't do it. So,
I was in the post office today and one of the younger fishing couples that I don't even know got a check from Copper River Seafoods, and the F-bombs that were going off were so discouraging, really. I mean, it was a very telling 2 minutes, because this gal was just ready to give up. You know, it was like this season has been a real jolt to their plans. And I mean, we've all been there periodically.
Yeah, a couple of things that I didn't put up there. One is people have commented on processors, the relationship with processors, and that kind of mixed relationship of processors will lend money sometimes, and so there'll be this kind of caretaker and provider on one hand, but then, and maybe this is more Bristol Bay, I don't remember, but there's that lack of transparency and trust in terms of pricing, and so it's sort of a yin-yang kind of relationship.
oh, you have that
With
here.
the processor, yeah. And then the other thing that I thought was really interesting was that, and I can't definitively say this, but I asked the graduate students, the young people that were surveyed, none of them brought up the resource, you know, the risk involved with, like, are the salmon still going to be there? I thought, wow, is that because they're so young that they don't remember that the salmon aren't always there? You know, they have this kind of confidence in the resource, and I thought that was pretty interesting. That that's maybe just that short-term youthful view on that, but that to me seems like another big one. Climate change.
Probably lack of education. I mean, how many high school students every day read about ocean acidification, or that pinks and reds are competing for food, hatchery versus wild? I don't know where, unless they're from fishing families or, you know, they have a finger on a pulse of environment, then they wouldn't hear about those things.
Well, I hope I didn't offend anybody by doing the grading thing. I feel like I'm way up there, so speak with authority of that.
I've heard the term for a long time.
I think it came from Petersburg, don't you think? Petersburg was one of the first communities, maybe about 10 or 12 years ago, that got together as a community, and they had a meeting with bankers and fishermen and processors and some school people, and talked about this concept that every time a boat in Petersburg is sold and leaves the region, it's basically like a small business that's closing in your community. And I thought that was pretty, so I think that that's sort of where the graying of the fleet concept came from, and I think it's a really good analogy that is very clear to people who are not in fishing communities when you say that to them. It's like, oh, okay, I get that.
One thing I just thought of, have you looked at the Russian fleet? Because Cordova itself is at a really healthy entry of young Russian.
That's a really interesting
Members of
idea,
the
actually.
fleet.
That's a good idea.
I'm not sure of their model. I've heard they've explained it to me a few times. I'm not sure we could learn much from our copy as much, but it's very successful in that.
Well, the other very culturally identified community, Kodiak, is one that the fishing permit numbers have not gone down, and
Yeah, they partner.
we haven't dug in there yet to kind of see if there's any particular reason for that. And Kodiak's in the terms of Bristol Bay, it's not a super productive region, but it's also very singular, and I think it's exclusive registration now, isn't it, Troy?
Up to a date, essentially after.
Yeah.
They partnered, the village partnered with a processor to build a plant.
Right. Yep.
Great, well, thank you so much.